In this video, we'll learn about loops and iteration in JavaScript. Loops are the third fundamental controller structure in structured programming after sequence and selection. They allow you to execute code repeatedly, which is essential for processing collections of data and automating repetitive tasks. So let's just start with the while loop. It repeats as long as the condition is true. See an example of this. So here, if we start with counter at 0, while counter is less than 5, we print the value and increment it. We see 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. When counter reaches 5, the condition is false and the loop exits. This is very similar to how you write a while loop in a language like Java or C++. Now likewise, JavaScript also has do-while variation. So this is how the do-while looks like. The difference is that the do-while loop, its body executes at least once before it checks the condition. So here in this example, even though counter is 10 and the condition is false, the body executes once and prints 10. Then the condition is checked, it's false, and the loop exits. So let's run it and see it happens. Now, what we can do is if I were to update this to something like 5 and run it again, then you see we get 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and when it gets to 10, then it exits the loop. We also have the familiar for loop here. So the general syntax is you have an initialization statement, a condition statement, an update statement, and then you follow that with the body of the loop that can execute whatever number of statements you have in there repeatedly as long as the condition is true. It's a very simple example of it. So for let I takes the value of 0 as long as I is less than 5, increment I by 1, and so you run this, you're going to get values 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So make a note of how this gets executed. So you first do the initialization, and this happens once. Then you enter the loop, you print it, then you check. You print it, you increment, then you check. If the check is correct, you print it again, you increment, you check. So that's how this gets executed. All right, let's look at a situation that is technically, syntactically correct, but it's not something that I personally consider good style. So you can use multiple statements in each place, like define multiple variables or have multiple update statements. So let me show you how that works. So let's say I have this array, and here I'm defining two variables. I have I, which initializes to 0, and then I have j, which is initialized to the last element. And I'm saying as long as I is less than j, increment I, and decrement j. So what I'm basically doing is that I'm using two pointers, two indices. I starts in the left side, j starts on the right side, and I'm moving I forward, so I is gets incremented, and I'm moving j backward, j gets decremented. And when these two meet, I stop. And what I'm doing is that at every step of the way, I'm swapping the values pointed to by I and j, and that's going to help me to reverse this array. So let's take a look at the result of it. This is one would say a clever way of writing an operation to reverse a collection. If I were to write it, I'd probably replace this with a while loop. And so that way the condition is clean, the updated statements are clean, the initialization are clean. This makes it a little convoluted to figure out what is going on in the code. Let's talk about how you can alter the flow of your loop. So there are two statements that you can use to do that. One is the break statement. The break statement allows you to immediately exit the loop. So here's an example for it. I have an array, I have a target value. This is basically linear search. So you will start at the first element, you go over every element one at a time, you compare it to the target. If it's a match, you found what you were looking for. You can stop at that point. You don't need to continue the search. If that's not the case, you just continue, and potentially you can go all the way to the last element and not find the target. So here's an example of it. This shows that the target was found at index 2, which is here. All right. The other way that you can alter the behavior of a loop is using continuous statement. Continuous statement allows you to skip over an iteration. So here's an example of it. Let's say I have a bunch of values in an array, and I want to add them up and get the count to calculate the average. So I can run this code and you see that it works and it shows me the average value. But the way I have constructed it is that I'm going to account for missing values. If you carefully look at my array, there is actually a missing value in here, right? So you have 10, comma, and then there's nothing here, you have comma. So that's going to end up being undefined. Then you have 30, comma, and then you have another comma here, which means it's going to be another undefined value. So this could be helpful if like you're dealing with a data set that maybe some values are missing for whatever reason. Like maybe you ask students to rate a lesson that you gave them or a movie that they watched, and not everybody obliged. So some of them didn't provide feedback for you, and you want to take them out of your calculation when you calculate the average. So this if statement says that if an element was undefined, it didn't exist, then continue. It means that skip over and go to the next iteration of the loop. All right, so when to use each loop? Well, while loop is, we call it typically event controlled or sentinel controlled. So you usually use it when you don't know how many iterations you have, but you're looking at some condition, and as long as that condition is true, you want to continue doing something. Like maybe ask the user to provide a valid input, and as long as they're not providing the valid input, you repeatedly ask them to correct what they're providing you. Do while, very similar to while loop, but the only difference is that if it's important to execute it at least once. For loop, it's a lot more common to use it when you know how many times you want to iterate. So you would have a counter, and that's why it's often called a counter control loop. Technically, you can mimic the behavior of any of these with the other two. Now I want to show you something else. There are some enhanced for loop built into JavaScript as well. So there are actually two of them. The first one is for off loop. This allows you to iterate over iterable objects. Now, if you're coming from data structures, this is going to make more sense to you. If not, essentially the way you can think about it is that if you have a collection of values like arrays, then this allows you to go over every element without having to use a counter or an index. So here's an example of it. I have an array and I say for let item of this array, and this allows me to basically go over every element of this array. And so it could be helpful if you're dealing with data structures that are not positional, such as a set. It can also be helpful in a sense that because you don't manage the index calculation, this is less prone to error. So if you are indexing over an array, it's common that you may miss the first one or the last one. It's so common, in fact, they give it a name. They call it off by one error. The other enhanced for loop in JavaScript is for in loop. So for in loop allows you to iterate over enumerable objects. These are the objects that have keys. They have property names. And so what this allows you to do is it allows you to go over the keys of an object. But it also works with like arrays and strings, because technically those also are objects. So let me show you an example. This is an example where it probably makes sense to use this for in loop. So I have an object, it has a bunch of properties, key values, and I can create a for loop that says for every key in this object, print the key, and I can even print the associated property with it. So just to show you that it works with like arrays, for example, as well. Here's the case. Here's an example. You can run this with an array, but what it does is that it's going to return actually the indices to you. And what's more funny is that those indices are strings. So take a look at what comes out of this. So I'm printing the key, which is the index, so 0, 1, 2, and notice that the indices are strings. And then the values, if I use the key to index through the array, then I get the actual values. So this is telling you that like under the hood, what this array really is like an object that looks like this. it's like 0, and then it gets mapped to the first value, and then it's like 1, and it gets mapped to 11, and so on and so forth. So that's really what this array is. This is a little confusing because it's very easy to forget which loop is which. I often forget it. So when you use off here, you're iterating over the actual values, the elements. When you're using in, you're actually going over the keys rather than the values. So as I said, going over the keys makes more sense when you use it with objects. So generally, it's not considered a good practice, or at least it's not encouraged to go over something like arrays in this fashion. I said earlier that you can use loops for both of these enhanced loop with the strings as well. So let me show you a case of using for off and then a case of using for in. So here's a string greeting, hello, and you can say for every character of greeting, and this will print each character out for you. And if you were to do this with strings, if you were to do for in with the strings, it would again treat it like as if it is a array of characters, and then it will go over every character and every key of the character. So something similar to the situation here will happen. So you get like 0, 1, 2. Those will be the keys, and those keys will be strings. And of course, you can use the key to access the character in that string. So here's how it looks like. All right. So the enhanced for loops, as I mentioned earlier, they're used with iterable objects. An example of that was array, or enumerable objects. An example of it was, a regular object. The notion of having iterable or numerable objects, it's a more advanced concept, and we will be covering it in chapter 11 under the advanced topics. But this is a good coverage about iteration for now. So what we covered in this video, we talked about loops in JavaScript. You have while loop, do while loop, and for loop. And in addition to that, you have enhanced for loops, which are for off, that you would use to go over array values, and for in, which you use to iterate over object properties. We've also seen break and continuous statements that allow you to control the execution of loops.